Good morning, everyone. My name is Aaliya Hegde, and today I'll be presenting my MSc research exploring the psychological and structural risk factors in domestic abuse, an issue that remains pervasive yet often misunderstood. Domestic abuse is often misunderstood as only physical violence. In reality, it includes emotional abuse, controlling behavior, financial control, and abuse through technology, such as tracking or isolating someone online. The aim of this research was to review current studies and identify which psychological and structural factors increase the likelihood of someone becoming abusive. The research question that guided this work was, what are the key factors that contribute to domestic abuse in adulthood? This is important because many people assume abuse is caused by just one issue, like mental health or poor communication. But it's often a combination of personal history, emotional struggles, social norms, and legal or economic pressures. In this presentation, I will walk through the background theories, the methods I use, key findings, and what these results tell us about prevention and support. Let's begin by looking at the theories that helped frame the research. To understand domestic abuse more deeply, we need to look at the different theories that explain why it happens. First, attachment theory suggests that people who had unsafe or neglectful relationships as children may grow up feeling insecure. As adults, they might fear rejection and try to control their partner to feel safe. Cognitive-behavioural theory helps us understand how harmful thoughts or beliefs can lead to abuse. For example, someone might believe that they must be in charge at all times, or that being challenged means they're being disrespected. Trauma theories show how people who've been through serious stress or harm, especially in childhood, can struggle with emotions later in life. This can lead to anger, fear, or aggressive responses in relationships. Then we have sociocultural theories and feminist perspectives, which focus on society's role. These point out how gender roles, poverty, and legal systems can support or allow abuse to continue, especially when victims don't have the resources to leave. All these theories show that abuse doesn't come from one place. It often is the result of many overlapping issues. In the next part, I'll explain how I used systematic methods to gather and analyze research on this topic. This research used a systematic review method. That means instead of doing my own interventions or experiments, I carefully gathered and analyzed existing studies to understand what they say about the causes of domestic abuse. I followed the PRISMA guidelines, which are used to make sure the research reviews are done in clear, fair, and an organized way. To decide what studies to include, I used a method called SPIDER. This helped me choose studies that focused on adults, looked at domestic abuse, and explored psychological or structural risk factors. I searched 4 main databases, which were PsycInfo, PubMed, Scopus, and Science Direct, and started with over 3,600 studies. After reviewing all the titles, summaries, and full texts, I ended up with 15 peer-reviewed studies that met all the criteria. These studies used different methods. Some were interviews, others were surveys or statistical models. This variety gave and provided a broader picture. I then used something called a thematic analysis, which means I read through all the studies and looked for repeating patterns or key ideas. That's how I found the main themes like trauma, emotional issues, and economic stress. Finally, I used a tool called CASP to check how strong and trustworthy each study was. This helped me make sure the conclusions I drew were based on solid evidence. Now that I've explained how the research was done, let's move on to what I found, the main themes that show up again and again in the research on domestic abuse. Before we look at what the studies found, it's important to explain which studies were included and why. This helps make sure the review was focused, fair, and based on high-quality evidence. I used clear inclusion criteria to choose which studies to include. These were based on the SPIDER tool, which helps researchers select studies that are most relevant for qualitative and mixed method reviews. The included studies had to meet all of the following criteria. So they had to be empirical and peer-reviewed. This means the studies were based on real data and had been reviewed by experts before publication. The design, they could be qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods, so interviews, surveys, statistical analysis, and more were all allowed. The focus of the papers had to explore either psychological or structural risk factors in adult domestic abuse, things like trauma, poverty, mental health, or legal systems. The language were studies only written in English. The region, studies from any country were considered as long as they offered insights into domestic or intimate partner violence. These criteria helped narrow down over 3,600 results into 15 high-quality studies that were directly relevant to the research question. With those filters in place, I was able to focus on the most useful and trustworthy studies. Now let's move on to the main themes that came out of this review. From the 15 studies I reviewed, 8 major themes came up repeatedly. These are the most common factors linked to the risk of domestic abuse, especially intimate partner violence in adults. So let's briefly go through each of them. The first one was childhood trauma. Many people who become abusive or are abused have experienced trauma growing up, such as neglect, violence, or unstable homes. This shapes how they behave in relationships later on. Second is attachment insecurity. If someone didn't feel safe or cared for as a child, they may grow up feeling anxious or afraid in relationships. This can lead to controlling or dependent behaviors. The third was emotional dysregulation. This means struggling to manage strong emotions. People who lash out or shut down emotionally may not know how to cope in healthy ways, especially under stress. Fourth is substance use. Alcohol and drugs don't directly cause abuse, but they make it worse. They lower self-control and increase aggression, especially in people already dealing with emotional pain. For the fifth one, we have coercive control. This is a key form of abuse that often goes unseen. It includes isolating someone, controlling what they do, or constantly monitoring them, not through violence, but through fear and pressure. Then we have technology-facilitated abuse. This is a newer form where abusers use phones, apps, or social media to monitor, harass, or isolate their partners. It can happen even when they're not physically present. Then we have poverty, which was financial stress adds pressure to relationships and can trap people in unsafe situations. It's harder to leave or get help when someone depends on their abuser for money or housing. Then, finally, we have cultural norms. In some communities, gender roles or societal expectations make abuse more likely, or make it harder for people to speak up or seek help. These themes are often connected. For example, someone with childhood trauma might also struggle with emotions and substance use, or someone facing poverty may also live in a culture where abuse is almost normalized. These themes give us a clearer picture of the risk landscape. And in the next session, I'll look more closely at the psychological side, how the mind, emotions, and personal history influence abuse. Now, let's take a closer look at the psychological risk factors that were found across the studies in this review. These are internal personal factors that influence how people think, feel, and behave in relationships. The first and most common factor is trauma and adverse childhood experiences. Many studies show that people who experience abuse, neglect, or instability in childhood are more likely to be involved in domestic abuse later in life, either as perpetrators or victims. Trauma shapes how we understand trust, safety, and control. Next is attachment insecurity. This means someone may fear abandonment or not know how to feel close to others safely. These patterns often begin in early relationships with caregivers. In adult relationships, this can lead to jealousy, control, or emotional withdrawal. Mental health difficulties are also important. Conditions like depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder are common in both victims and perpetrators. Poor mental health can make it harder to regulate emotions, communicate, or respond calmly in stressful situations. Finally, substance use is a major risk factor. Alcohol or drug misuse doesn't directly cause abuse, but it increases the chances of violence and poor decision-making. It can also reduce emotional control and increase impulsivity. Several studies show that people who use substances often do so to cope with trauma or emotional pain. So substance use and abuse often feed into each other. These psychological factors rarely act alone. Instead, they often interact with each other and with structural issues like poverty or weak legal support. Next, we'll explore these broader social structural factors and shape the context of domestic abuse. While psychological factors help us understand what's happening inside individuals, we also need to look at the bigger picture, the social and structural issues that influence domestic abuse. These are the conditions around a person that make abuse more likely, harder to escape, or easier to hide. A major theme in the research was coercive control. This is when one partner uses fear, isolation, or pressure to control the other person's behavior. It often doesn't involve physical violence, but it can be just as harmful. It might include things like constantly checking someone's phone, controlling where they go, or limiting who they can speak to. A newer form of this is technology-facilitated abuse. Abusers might use GPS tracking spyware, or social media to watch, harass, or intimidate their partners. This makes the abuse constant, even when the person isn't physically present. Poverty and financial stress were also major structural risks. People who rely on their partner for housing or money can't afford to leave, even if the relationship is unsafe. This creates a trap that's very hard to escape without outside help. The studies also pointed to a legal and social gap. In some countries, laws against coercive control are weak or not enforced, even when protection exists. Victims may fear the police or worry they won't be believed, especially in marginalized communities. These factors do not separate from psychological ones. For example, someone with trauma and depression might also be in poverty and lack legal protection. These layers build on each other, making the situation worse. To summarize the core findings of this review, it is clear that domestic abuse cannot be understood through a single lens. First, the psychological factors such as childhood trauma, insecure attachment, emotional dysregulation, and substance use play a crucial and critical role in shaping how people engage in intimate relationships. These issues often relate to a person's ability to manage fear, anger, and control. Second, structural and social conditions like poverty, cultural expectations, and legal or digital vulnerabilities can increase risk and limit options for those in abusive relationships. What stands out across the studies is the diversity of abuse forms, not just physical violence, but also coercive control, emotional abuse, and tech-based manipulation. These forms are harder to detect and often misunderstood by professionals and the public. The key insight is that no single risk factor operates in isolation. Effective prevention and intervention must consider both the personal histories and social realities of those involved. In the next section, I'll explore how these different layers of risks interact and why an integrated view is so important for understanding intimate partner violence. As I mentioned before, this slide focuses on a critical insight from the review. The interactions between different risk factors are what make intimate partner violence, or IPV, so complex and challenging to address. Rather than viewing trauma, poverty, or tech abuse as separate problems, we need to understand how they combine and reinforce each other. For instance, a person who experienced early trauma may already struggle with emotional regulation. If they're also living in poverty, under legal threat, or being digitally monitored, those challenges multiply and can escalate very quickly. The research also shows that IPV doesn't follow a straight line. It is shaped up by a web of influences, including childhood environment, cultural norms, relationship dynamics, and access to support systems. This reinforces the need for holistic models of care, where trauma therapy, financial aid, legal protection, and community support are connected, not separated. Simply put, we can't understand domestic abuse by looking at one factor at a time. These interactions are where real risk and solutions emerge. While this review offers important insights, it's also essential to recognize its limitations so we understand where caution is needed and where future work should build. First of all included studies were published in English and peer-reviewed. This improves academic quality but also introduces language and access bias. Valuable insights from community reports, practitioner reflections, or research in other languages may have been excluded. Second, most of the studies came from Western countries like the UK, US, or Australia. As a result, the findings may not reflect the realities of domestic abuse in non-Western or minority cultural contexts. Third, many studies use cross-sectional designs, which means they capture a single moment in time. These are useful for spotting patterns, but they don't allow us to say what causes what or how situations change over time. finally, there were limited attention to underrepresented groups, so the LGBTQ community, migrants, disabled people, and other older adults. These populations face unique abuse risks and barriers, but they still rarely are the focus of research. What needs to happen next? Based on this review, there are 3 clear areas where action is needed, both in future research and real-world response. We need to explore more deeply how psychological and structural risk factors interact. Too many studies focus on one aspect, like trauma or poverty, without looking at how these layers combine to increase risk. We also need more studies on underrepresented groups and in non-Western settings. We need to develop holistic interventions, support services that should be designed to treat the whole person, not just a single issue. And finally, we need to strengthen policy and legal protections. Laws against coercive control and tech-facilitated abuse need to be stronger and need stronger enforcement. Survivors need to know that they'll be believed and protected, and policymakers also need to fund the essential services that help people leave unsafe relationships. The big message here is that domestic abuse is a shared responsibility. It requires collaboration between mental health, law, education, and community services. These recommendations have clear implications for professionals across clinical, legal, and community sectors. For example, trauma-informed care, legal aid access, and early intervention through education are essential components of an effective response. Looking ahead, this review highlights several important directions for future research on intimate partner violence. These suggestions respond to the gaps and limitations we've already discussed, and they focus on making research more relevant, inclusive, and forward-looking. Number 1, prioritize intersectionality. Future studies should look at how overlapping identities such as gender, race, disability, immigration status, and sexuality affect people's experiences of abuse. These intersections often create unique risks that are not fully captured in general population research. They should expand beyond Western contexts. Most of the current literature comes from the UK, US, or Australia. We need more research from non-Western, global South, and community-led perspectives to understand how abuse is experienced and responded to in different cultural, legal, or economic settings. Study new forms of technology-based abuse. As technology evolves, so does abuse. Future research should focus on AI-enabled manipulation, deepfakes, digital surveillance, and other emerging tech-facilitated risks that are currently under-recognized in academic literature. And finally, invest in long-term longitudinal studies. Many studies are cross-sectional, so they give us a snapshot but not the full story. We need longitudinal research that follows individuals over time to better understand how early experiences like trauma develop into patterns of abuse or vulnerability later in life. Overall, the future of IPV must be more global, inclusive, and dynamic. To close the presentation, I want to leave you with a clear and lasting message. Domestic abuse is not only about violence, it is about pain, power, and structural barriers. This review has shown that intimate partner violence is shaped by a mix of psychological factors like trauma, insecure attachment, and emotional dysregulation, and social conditions such as poverty, digital surveillance, and legal gaps. It also shows that these risks do not exist in isolation. They interact, reinforcing one another and making abuse harder to escape and harder to treat. Healing from abuse, whether for survivors or perpetrators, requires more than counseling. It requires systematic change. Access to housing, financial support, protective legal systems, and services that work together across sectors. If we want to reduce domestic abuse in real terms, we need to move beyond asking, why doesn't she feel safe? And start asking, what conditions make her feel unsafe, unsupported, or trapped, and how can we change them? The evidence is clear. Change is possible, but only when we address both the emotional and structural causes of harm. Thank you for listening. I hope this research encourages you to see domestic abuse as a shared social responsibility and as something we all have a role in preventing. Here are all the references that were used in this presentation. Thank you so much for listening once again. If you have any questions, please put them in the comment box and I'll reply to you as soon as possible. Thank you.